Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, here to guide you today. Many of you use these videos to relax or drift off to sleep, so before we begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Now, settle in, get comfy, and let's begin. I was with my college friends on a weekend camping trip in the woods near us. For privacy, I'll call them Ryan and Jamie. Neither Ryan nor I had much experience with outdoor activities, so Jamie took the lead. He guided us to a small spot by the river that he had been to before. It was a couple of miles through the woods, but we eventually reached a vast field by the river where we set up camp. Nobody else was around, so we pitched our tents in the middle of the field between the woods and the water, then brought out some beers and sat around a campfire. Not long after settling in, I spotted some people near the tree line. They looked like hunters, dressed in dirty clothes and carrying backpacks, blending in with the woods. However, I didn't see any rifles. They were quite far away, so I might have just missed them. I pointed them out to my friends, but Jamie looked concerned. He mentioned that hunting in these woods was illegal, and it wasn't even hunting season. Ryan brushed it off with a joke, saying Jamie was overreacting, and we returned to our random conversations. A few hours later, we decided to call it a night. The sun had long set, and the hike had exhausted us. We all went into our tents, but I found it hard to sleep. Something about being out in the open, in a small tent on a thin blow-up mattress, felt unsettling. I tossed and turned for about 2 hours, hoping to get some rest, when suddenly, I was wide awake. I heard footsteps approaching our tents. At first, I thought it was Ryan or Jamie, maybe returning from the bathroom. But then I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps too, 3, maybe more, all walking in a line. I stared at the thin wall of my tent, expecting to see lights from whoever was coming toward us, but there weren't any. Surely, anyone out there would have seen our tents in the middle of the open field. Nobody in their right mind would just walk past like that without acknowledging us. I froze, pretending to be asleep, listening as the footsteps got closer. The group walked just feet from our tents before continuing past us. As soon as they were far enough away, I quietly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. At the same moment, Ryan did the same. We exchanged alarmed glances and then looked toward the group. They were faintly visible but still walking away. I slipped out of my tent and woke Jamie, explaining what had happened. Surprisingly, Jamie seemed even more horrified than we were. He had camped many times before and knew how unusual this was. We decided to pack up and leave, feeling too uneasy to stay. As we were hurriedly gathering our things, Jamie suddenly froze, his voice trembling as he urged us to hurry. Following his gaze, we saw the group standing in the tree line, now 5 or 6 people, staring at us. My adrenaline surged. We shoved our gear into our bags and sprinted toward the trail, leaving our lights off to avoid being seen. The rest of the walk was in near darkness, but fortunately, we made it back safely. Even now, I have no idea what those people were doing out there, but I'm certain our encounter wasn't a coincidence. This happened a long time ago, back when I was 13 years old. It was summertime, and I spent most of my days either playing on my PS3 or watching whatever was on TV. Occasionally, I'd go outside or hang out with friends, but on this particular day, it was raining heavily, so I stayed inside. My dad worked late until 10 p.m., and my mom, being a nurse, had an unpredictable schedule. That day, I spent hours on my PS3 until around 7 p.m. when I went to the kitchen to make something to eat. While I was in there, I heard a knock at the front door. I didn't want to answer. It always made me nervous when someone came to the door unexpectedly. I decided to stay quiet, hoping they'd leave. However, the knocking continued persistently. Curious and uneasy, I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, it was a police officer standing on the porch, looking around as if waiting for someone to answer. His uniform was soaked from the rain. Feeling obligated, I opened the door, despite my apprehension. The cold rain made the scene feel even more unsettling. The officer greeted me and asked for my name. While he reassured me that everything was fine, I couldn't shake the fear. I was immediately fixated on the gun at his hip, feeling intimidated and scared. The officer then smiled, attempting to calm me, but his teeth were rotting and yellow, which I found incredibly off-putting. On closer inspection, his overall appearance was disheveled and unkempt, far from what you'd expect from a police officer. He seemed to notice my hesitation and quickly explained that he needed to search the house. That's when my gut told me something was very wrong. I glanced outside and noticed there was no police car parked anywhere near my house, especially out given the pouring rain. The realization hit me hard. This man wasn't who he claimed to be. The red flags were piling up, and as he began stepping inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it. He didn't say anything, he just started slamming something against the door with enough force to shake it. Terrified, I stumbled backward, fearing the door might give in. Panicking, I grabbed the home phone and dialed 911. I could barely get my words out as I explained what was happening, but the operator understood enough to send help. The man outside didn't stop. He continued banging on the door, trying to force his way in. When the actual police arrived, I could hear him arguing with them, desperately trying to convince them he was an officer. Of course, they didn't believe him, and he was taken into custody. My parents didn't tell me much about what happened next, likely to protect me. It wasn't until years later that I learned during the interrogation he admitted he had planned to kidnap me. To this day, I shudder to think what might have happened if I'd trusted him even for a moment. This happened a long time ago, back when I was 13 during the summer. I spent most of my days either playing on my PS3 or watching whatever was on TV. Occasionally, I'd go outside or meet up with friends, but on this particular day, it was raining heavily, so I stayed inside. My dad worked late, usually until 10 p.m., and my mom, being a nurse, had a chaotic schedule. That day, I had been playing PS3 for hours until around 7 p.m. when I went to the kitchen to make some food. While I was there, I heard a knock at the front door. I didn't want to answer it. As a kid, I was always nervous about unexpected visitors, so I stayed quiet, hoping they'd leave. After several persistent knocks, my curiosity got the better of me, and I sneaked over to the door to look through the peephole. To my surprise and confusion, there was a police officer standing on our porch. He was looking around, waiting for someone to answer. His uniform was drenched from the rain. Feeling like I couldn't ignore him, I hesitantly opened the door. The cold, rainy evening added to my unease. He greeted me and asked for my name, then reassured me that everything was okay. Despite his words, I couldn't shake the fear. My eyes were drawn to the gun on his hip, and I felt scared, like I might be in trouble. The officer smiled as if trying to ease my nerves, but his yellow, rotting teeth only made him look unsettling. That's when I started to notice how disheveled and unkempt he was, completely unlike what I expected a police officer to look like. He seemed to sense my hesitation and quickly told me he needed to search the house. That's when it all felt wrong. Looking outside, I noticed there was no police car near our house, which was especially strange given the pouring rain. The red flags were piling up. As he stepped forward, I instinctively slammed the door shut and locked it. He didn't say a word, but immediately started slamming something against the door, shaking it violently. I stumbled back, terrified that the door might give way. In a panic, I grabbed the home phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaking so much that I was surprised the operator could even understand me. Meanwhile, the man outside kept banging on the door. Even when the real police arrived, he was still there, trying to convince them he was one of them. His act didn't last long, and they took him into custody. At the time, my parents didn't tell me much about the charges, likely to protect me. It wasn't until years later that I found out during interrogation, the man admitted he had planned to kidnap me. Thinking back, I'm grateful for my gut instinct. If I had trusted him for even a moment, I might not be here to tell this story. I work at a gas station and have been there for several years. Most nights are uneventful, and I assumed this shift would be no different. I started at 8 p.m., taking over from the day worker who left right away. The first couple of hours went by quickly, with a steady stream of customers coming in to grab snacks or pay for gas. However, as the clock crept past 11 p.m., the pace slowed considerably. Between 11 and midnight, things got so quiet that the shift started to drag. I tried to stay busy by restocking shelves and finding little tasks, but soon I was left with the dreaded second half of the shift slow, monotonous, and dull. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled into the parking spaces near the entrance. While a few cars had come by recently to get gas, it was rare for someone to park and enter the store this late. I straightened up, rubbed the tiredness from my eyes, and waited for whoever it was to come in. But minutes passed, and nobody did. Curious, I leaned over the counter and tried to look out the glass door. Unfortunately, the reflections made it impossible to see into their car. I figured they might just be taking a break from a long drive, so I didn't think much of it. I sat back down and pulled out my phone, mindlessly scrolling through articles for about 20 minutes. During that time, I heard nothing and saw nothing unusual. But when I glanced up from my phone, my heart nearly stopped. There was a man inside the store, standing in one of the aisles, staring directly at me. As soon as I made eye contact, his eyes darted away. He looked like he was in his mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket and sporting a scruffy beard. What unnerved me the most was that I hadn't seen or heard him come in. How did he get inside? I watched him carefully as he wandered through the aisles, occasionally glancing over at me as though he were trying to gauge if I was watching him. His behavior felt off, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to act. Then, just 30 seconds later, he suddenly bolted toward the front door and ran outside. I quickly got up and ran to the window to see where he went. The car was still parked in the lot, but the man walked right past it and disappeared down the road until I could no longer see him. Alarmed, I checked the security cameras to figure out how he'd entered. It only took a minute to find the footage. The man had quietly exited the car, walked around to the back of the station, and slipped in through an unlocked back door. The gas station didn't have cameras in the back, and the door was left unlocked since the station was technically always open. What puzzled me the most was that there was a 15-minute gap between the time he entered through the back and when he appeared on the sales floor. What had he been doing during that time? The police came to investigate and discovered that the car he arrived in had been reported stolen months ago. They couldn't determine who he was or what his intentions were that night. Clearly, he had some plan in mind, but for some reason, he decided not to go through with it. Looking back, I can't help but feel fortunate that he left without doing anything worse. Story: a night alone. I was off work this particular night and relaxing at home. My roommate was out of town for a few days visiting his parents. Being a bit of a night owl, I enjoyed staying up late. It was around midnight, and I was sipping on a beer while watching TV when I faintly heard a sound from above me. At first, I didn't even process it, my body just ignored it. But after a few seconds, it hit me. It couldn't have been my roommate since he wasn't home. I looked up at the ceiling and muted the TV to listen again. A few seconds passed, but there was nothing. The sound had been so soft, and with the TV on at the time, I couldn't even tell where it might have come from. Although it sounds a bit foolish in hindsight, I wasn't concerned enough to get up and check. Instead, I opened the mini fridge next to the couch, grabbed another beer, and sat back down to relax. Before I could unmute the TV, though, I heard the same thumping noise again, coming from above. I stared at the ceiling, now fully alert. After a moment, I could hear faint footsteps slowly moving in the room directly above me. My entire body went numb. Getting up from the couch, I made my way to the stairs. Standing at the bottom, I could hear the thumping sound echoing faintly through the upstairs hallway. I called out my roommate's name, even though I knew it couldn't be him. I was just hoping, somehow, it was. After getting no reply, I cautiously climbed the stairs and switched on the hallway light. The hallway was empty, but the door at the far end was open. It was my roommate's room. I was certain I had closed that door the day he left, and I hadn't been in there since, so there was no reason it should be open. My heart raced as I slowly walked down the hallway and peeked inside. The room looked exactly as it did when my roommate left, clean, tidy, and undisturbed. I nervously checked every other room upstairs, but found nothing unusual. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. For the next couple of days, I stayed on edge, waiting anxiously for my roommate to return. Strangely, I never heard those sounds again, nor did any doors randomly open after that night. To this day, I still don't know what happened. Maybe someone managed to find a way in and out without me realizing, or maybe it was something far stranger. Whatever it was, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something deeply unsettling occurred that night. Story 1. The night at the pizza shop. My name is Leo, and I work at a pizza shop in a small town. I don't handle deliveries, but do everything else inside, from making pizzas to organizing stations, cleaning, and handling closing tasks. My interaction with customers is usually limited since we have high school employees taking orders until 11 p.m. on weekdays. After that, the shop closes at 12:30 a.m., leaving me responsible for any remaining orders or walk-ins. It was a typical Monday shift. Everything ran smoothly, and my co-worker left at 11 p.m., leaving me alone to close up. The night was slow, so I started cleaning about 30 minutes before closing. Then, a call came in. Hoping it wasn't a last-minute order, I answered with the usual greeting, but after a brief pause, the caller hung up. Frustrated, I dismissed it as a prank. Not even 30 seconds later, I heard the bell at the front door. Annoyed, I set my cleaning tools aside and walked to the counter. A man was standing there, wearing a heavy coat and a black beanie. His disheveled appearance put me on edge. Dark circles under wide-open eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. "How can I help you?" I asked, keeping my distance. He replied, "I'd like to place an order right now," but his tone was unsettling. As he struggled to respond to my follow-up, I noticed his hand partially hidden in his coat pocket. My stomach dropped. He was holding a kitchen knife, the blade partly visible. Just as panic set in, the sound of the door opening startled both of us. Another customer entered, immediately sensing the tension. The man at the counter froze, then walked past the newcomer and out the door. I quickly called 911, explaining what happened. The other customer and I watched as the man drove off in his car. Later, I realized he might have watched the shop from outside, waiting for me to answer the phone and confirm I was alone. If not for the random customer's arrival, I'm not sure what would have happened. Thankfully, I haven't seen him since, and I hope it stays that way. Story: a stormy night in the basement. I was 17, living in my parents' basement, which was more like an in-law suite than a typical unfinished space. My parents traveled often for work, so I was usually alone during their trips. On this particular Saturday, I had no school or plans, but a storm was rolling in later that day. Before it hit, I took my parents' car to the store to stock up on food. As I drove back, the storm arrived. Visibility was poor, even with the wipers on full speed. I finally reached home, hurried inside, and dried off. After turning on the oven to make dinner, I heard a noise from the basement. It sounded like something falling over, perhaps a box. My first thought was a leak or a flood, so I went to check. I opened the basement door, turned on the light, and walked down the stairs. Everything seemed fine at first. The main area where I had a small couch and TV looked untouched. Then I checked the storage room, the only unfinished part of the basement. Initially, everything appeared normal. But as I looked closer, I saw one of the boxes at the top of a stack had been opened. Its contents, my parents' old trophies, were scattered and broken, as if someone had hastily tossed them back in. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, the storm's noise masking any potential sounds. Just as I started backing away, another box in the corner fell. Behind it, a man suddenly lunged at me. Terrified, I sprinted up the stairs, hearing his footsteps close behind. On the last step, I tripped and fell, fearing the worst. But when I turned around, the man reached the top of the stairs, saw me, and bolted out the front door. I locked the door and called the cops. They found an unlocked window where he'd entered, but couldn't determine his motive. To this day, I have no idea why he was in my house or what he wanted, and that uncertainty still haunts me. Story 1. A late night breakdown. I was leaving work late due to a recent security issue at my company that had everyone working overtime. Normally, I'd take the train, but knowing I'd be out past its running hours, I drove instead. The drive home was nearly an hour, and as I left the city, I noticed my gas gauge was almost empty. I didn't remember it being this low earlier, but I assumed I'd missed it in my exhaustion. I planned to fill up at a gas station near my house, but 10 minutes later, my dashboard flashed a warning that my fuel was critically low. The needle had dropped far faster than it should have, and soon after, my car started sputtering before the engine cut out entirely. Frustrated and confused, I pulled over and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment to investigate. It only took a few seconds to find the problem. Gas was leaking from my tank. I had no idea how this could have happened, as everything seemed fine earlier. Before I could process it, a truck pulled up behind me. Its headlights were off, and it parked quickly and decisively. I stood up, aiming my flashlight at the windshield, where I saw a couple of figures moving inside. "I'm okay, don't need any help," I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, one of the truck's doors opened and a man stepped out. "Need a ride?" he asked, smirking as he approached. Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I declined firmly and quickly got back into my car, locking the doors. The man stood outside my window for what felt like an eternity, staring at me silently. I called the police, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. Eventually, he walked back to the truck, got in, and drove off slowly. As he passed, I glanced at his back seat and froze. Someone was pressed against the window, wide-eyed and motionless. It didn't look like they were there willingly. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They found that my gas tank had been intentionally punctured, likely by someone who'd followed me, hoping I'd accept their help. Unfortunately, the truck's license plate was missing, and the man was never found. To this day, I wonder about the person in the back seat and what might have happened if I hadn't locked my doors. The stranger in the forest. I was backpacking through the national parks in Washington state, about 20 miles from the nearest road. For the first 2 days, I hadn't seen a single person, as the colder fall weather likely kept others away. That morning, I brewed coffee on my pocket stove before starting a 6-mile hike to the next campsite. For hours into the trek, I heard footsteps ahead. Looking up, I saw a man walking the trail in the opposite direction. I nodded and smiled as he passed, but something about him seemed off. He wasn't carrying a backpack, water bottle, or any supplies, just a long-sleeved t-shirt and old hiking pants. Confused, I glanced back, only to see him looking back at me. I turned forward quickly to avoid making it awkward. Shrugging it off, I assumed he might have a campsite nearby, though I knew there weren't any established ones in the area. Several hours later, I reached my campsite. It was a small, secluded area surrounded by trees, with little to no view despite being on a mountain. Exhausted, I set up my tent and relaxed, watching the sunset. Then I heard shuffling behind me. Turning, I was stunned to see the same man from earlier. He still had no supplies and shouldn't have been there, as he was walking the opposite way when we crossed paths. Somehow, he'd turned back and reached my campsite. Without acknowledging me, he walked to the other side of the clearing and sat down on the dirt, staring into the forest. He had no tent, sleeping bag, or anything, which made me incredibly uneasy. As the sun set, the darkness amplified my fear. After 30 minutes of silence, I decided I couldn't stay. I began packing my gear, and only then did the man look at me. He didn't take his eyes off me as I hurriedly stuffed my belongings into my pack. When I finally moved to leave, he stood up and started following me. Clutching my knife, I walked as fast as I could, his footsteps close behind. After a minute, I veered off the trail into the woods, hoping the darkness would hide me. Leaning against a tree, I waited, watching as his silhouette appeared on the trail. He stopped, looked around, and then started calling out in a disturbingly friendly tone. After a few minutes of yelling, he fell silent. Instead of heading back to the campsite, he walked into the woods on the opposite side of the trail, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed hidden for over an hour before sneaking back to the trail and continuing my hike. I skipped the next campsite entirely, pushing through until I reached town. There I reported the incident to the police, but they never followed up. I don't know if the man was living in the woods, looking to rob or harm people, or something worse. I'm just grateful I got away. Story 1. A close call at the drive-through cafe. I was working my usual closing shift, from 2 to 10 p.m., at a small drive-through cafe. The place wasn't much, a handful of tables inside, with most business coming through the drive-through. Late nights were especially quiet, and being the only person on shift, I'd often sit at a table, scrolling on my phone and waiting for a customer to roll through. This particular night was even slower than usual. It had been drizzling since early evening, and after 7 p.m., not a single car had come through. 2 hours later, I was still sitting at one of the dining tables, watching Netflix on my phone, when the front door suddenly opened. Startled, I looked up. It was unusual for anyone to come inside this late. A man walked in, his presence immediately unsettling. He was tall and dressed entirely in dark clothing. Though it had only been drizzling outside, he was soaking wet, water dripping from his clothes and forming small puddles on the floor. What unnerved me even more was how he didn't seem to notice me sitting there. Instead, he walked across the room, sat at a table far from me, and faced away. Trying to stay professional, I stood up, walked over, and greeted him, asking if he'd like to order something. He didn't respond. His blank expression made me hesitate, but I repeated my question. This time, he interrupted me. "Who else is working tonight?" The question sent a wave of unease through me, but for some reason, I answered, "Just me, but we close in an hour." He then asked for a small coffee. Relieved to have something normal to do, I went to the kitchen to prepare it. As I turned back to bring him the coffee, I froze. He was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, staring at me with bloodshot eyes. His face remained emotionless, but his presence was deeply unsettling. "Put the drink down and come with me," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. He looked ready to enforce his words, and being smaller than him, I felt I had no choice. Slowly, I moved toward him, trying to think of an escape. Once outside, he grabbed the collar of my shirt and pushed me across the parking lot toward the road. On the other side of the road was a dense wooded area, with no houses or buildings nearby. Just as we were about to cross the road, a car rolled by a police cruiser. The officer inside locked eyes with us. I didn't hesitate. I started screaming for help. The man immediately let go of me and sprinted into the woods. The officer pulled into the parking lot and checked on me, calling for backup. It turned out he wasn't even on duty. He was heading home and happened to pass by at the perfect time. Security footage captured decent images of the man, but so far, no leads have surfaced. I often think about how close I came to disappearing into those woods. If the officer had been even 30 seconds earlier or later, the outcome might have been very different. A camping trip gone wrong just over 2 years ago. I decided to try camping for the first time. My name is Jake, and at the time, I had no experience in camping or hiking. I'd been wanting to try it for a while, and I figured the best way to learn was to go out and do it. I picked a campground 2 hours from my city that seemed ideal, not too crowded, but also not completely isolated. After arriving at the trailhead around noon, I hiked a few hours to reach the site. The campground had picnic tables, barbecue grills, and several smaller trails leading to individual campsites. I chose a spot, set up my tent, and ensured everything was working properly. A few other campers were in the central area, grilling and chatting. I wasn't very social, so I stayed by myself until one of them, a guy about my age named TJ, invited me to join. He seemed friendly, so I tagged along, meeting a few others and spending the next hour hanging out. As the sun began to set, I said goodnight and returned to my tent. Not long after, TJ came by, asking if I'd ever been to the area before. When I said no, he started talking about a hidden lake nearby, calling it a must-see spot. Intrigued, I agreed to follow him. He led me down a faint trail through the woods, claiming it was only a 10-minute walk. But as time passed, there was no lake in sight. TJ, once talkative and charismatic, grew quiet, offering only one-word responses. He kept glancing at the sunset, making me feel like he was waiting for something in the dark. Uneasy, I began putting distance between us. Finally, I turned and ran back the way we came. TJ noticed immediately, shouting after me. His tone started friendly, as if trying to convince me to come back, but quickly turned angry. I could hear him sprinting behind me. At one point, I heard a loud metallic clang, a knife hitting a tree near me. It must have been his last effort to stop me. I kept running until I reached the main campsite, where I told the others what happened. The police were called, but TJ, or whoever he was, disappeared. He had no tent or gear at the campsite, and no one knew much about him. I later realized he probably targeted me because I was inexperienced and alone. Whatever his intentions were, I'm thankful I listened to my instincts and ran. If I hadn't, I doubt I'd be here to tell this story. Story 1. The Airbnb intruder. This happened almost 2 years ago when I decided to take a vacation to visit my parents. To have some space for myself, I rented an Airbnb for the first time. The house was located on a large, quiet plot of land and was incredibly spacious. Coming from the city, it felt like pure luxury. After settling into the room, I quickly left to spend the afternoon with my family. Later that night, I returned to the Airbnb, made a snack, and relaxed on the couch to watch a movie. It was around 10 or 11 p.m. when I heard footsteps outside the house. The sound startled me because there was no mistaking it. Someone was walking near the house. I paused the movie and went to the back of the house to investigate. Peeking out the back door into the darkness, I saw a man walking away from the house toward the tree line. What really disturbed me was that I hadn't heard him approach. He must have been standing near the house for some time before I noticed. Once he was out of sight, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The patio was empty, but there were clear shoe prints in the grass leading up to one of the windows. When I looked through the window, my heart sank. The man had been standing in a spot with a direct view of the couch where I was sitting. The thought of him watching me, completely unaware, sent chills through my body. I quickly went back inside, locked the doors, and covered the windows. For the next half hour, I sat in the living room, the movie playing on low volume so I could listen for any sounds. I didn't hear anything more, and once the movie ended, I decided to check outside one last time before heading to bed. Pulling the curtains aside, I saw nothing at first, but then I heard footsteps fast and heavy sprinting away from the window. Hesitant, I peeked out and caught a glimpse of the same man running into the trees. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was long gone. As we searched the house, I noticed something even more unsettling. My suitcase in the bedroom had been opened, its contents rummaged through, and a few items were missing. I realized the man had likely entered the house earlier while I was with my family. He could have still been inside when I returned, sneaking out without me noticing. What horrifies me most is the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't caught him watching me. I might have gone to bed with him still lurking nearby. The creepy encounter on the Appalachian Trail. This happened in the fall of 2018, when I was 22. I was temporarily living near the Appalachian Mountains on the East Coast. I'd never been much of an outdoorsy person, nor had I tried camping or hiking before. However, with the beautiful fall weather and my time in the area coming to an end, I decided to give it a shot. I found a simple hiking trail with good views of the mountains, packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a first aid kit, and drove to the trailhead. It was a quiet, dirt parking lot with no other cars, making it clear this wasn't a popular trail. The path started off calm and scenic, with trees lining both sides. As I walked deeper, the forest grew denser, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating a shaded, almost serene atmosphere. I enjoyed the solitude at first, but as the hours passed, the thought of being completely alone began to feel unsettling. After about 2 hours, I spotted a man sitting on the side of the trail under a tree. As I passed, I gave him a friendly nod and said, "Hi." He looked up at me but didn't respond. No smile, no acknowledgement, just a blank stare. The encounter left me uneasy. Maybe he hadn't heard me, or perhaps I'd caught him off guard, but his silence and expressionless face didn't sit right. I quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between us. Eventually, I reached the end of the trail, where a beautiful overlook offered a stunning view of the fall foliage covering the mountains. I stood there for a few minutes, taking it all in, until I turned around to leave and nearly jumped out of my skin. The same man was standing at the trail's end, no more than 10 feet away. I hadn't heard him approach. He wasn't looking at the view, just standing there, staring at me. After a moment, he smiled and said, "Hi, how's the view?" His sudden friendliness was unnerving. I responded politely, saying it was great, and suggested he take a look. Instead of going to the overlook, he stepped closer and pointed to a faint, barely visible path off to the side. "There's an even better view down there," he said. The path was overgrown and rugged, clearly not part of the official trail. I declined, saying I needed to head back. He kept insisting, his tone growing more eager, as if he were trying to coax me into going. It became clear his intentions weren't innocent. I tried to leave, but he quickly moved to block the main trail. My heart raced as I considered my options. Slowly, I took a few steps around him, trying not to provoke a reaction. Thankfully, he didn't stop me, but as I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. Every time I looked back, he was still there, watching, making no attempt to hide it. Fortunately, he didn't follow, and I made it back to my car safely. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm sure they weren't good. That hidden path he pointed to likely led nowhere, or worse, to a place he intended to corner me. I can only be grateful I listened to my instincts and got out when I did. Story: the Halloween scare at the abandoned farm last year. When I was 16, my friend Leon and I were hanging out a few days before Halloween, brainstorming ideas for what to do during the holiday. We felt too old for trick-or-treating, but still wanted to do something fun and a bit thrilling. After tossing around some suggestions, I brought up an abandoned farm we both knew about and suggested we explore it. It seemed like the perfect mix of creepy and exciting, exactly what we were looking for during Halloween. We quickly agreed, but to avoid running into others who might have the same idea on Halloween night, we decided to go on October 30th. The plan was simple: check out the farm, maybe get a little spooked, and leave without causing any trouble. On the 30th, Leon drove us to a neighborhood near the farm. He parked on the street, and we walked through the quiet neighborhood until we reached the gravel driveway that led up to the property. The farm was set far back from the road, with a large field surrounding it. In the dim light of our flashlights, we could barely make out the outline of the barn on the left and the single-story farmhouse further back. As we made our way down the driveway, the crunch of gravel underfoot was the only sound, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The closer we got, the more surreal it felt to be there at night. By the time we reached the house, we could see it was in worse shape than we'd thought. Farming equipment, rusted and forgotten, was scattered around the property, and the porch door was covered by a thick wooden board. We circled the house, trying every door and window, but everything was sealed shut. Frustrated, we decided to check out the barn. The flattened grass leading to it wasn't a formal path, just a worn trail. As we walked toward the barn, an uneasy feeling settled over us. It was hard to explain, but the air seemed heavier, and the silence around us felt more oppressive. The barn door was wide open when we arrived. I stepped in first, Leon close behind, both of us shining our flashlights around. The first thing we noticed was the smell strong and foul, even for a barn. It wasn't long before we spotted something that made our unease grow. Footprints. They were scattered across the dusty floor, but didn't look like the random paths of kids exploring the place. Instead, they formed a distinct line, moving back and forth from one point at the far end of the barn. We followed the trail cautiously, our flashlights trembling as we approached the spot. It led to a wooden cellar hatch embedded in the barn floor. The hatch had a shiny, new padlock on it, starkly out of place compared to the barn's worn and decaying interior. Leon and I exchanged nervous glances. Before we could even process what we were looking at, a loud thud echoed through the barn, shaking the walls. We spun around, our hearts racing, to see that the large barn door had been slammed shut. Leon bolted toward it, shoving it back open with all of his strength. We both stepped outside, frantically scanning the area, but we didn't see anyone. Without saying a word, we took off running, cutting straight through the tall grass and onto the gravel driveway. We didn't stop until we reached the neighborhood and Leon's car. Out of breath and shaken, we looked back in the direction of the farm, but everything was eerily still and quiet. Whatever had just happened was more than we'd bargained for. Though we got the scare we were seeking, it was far beyond anything we anticipated. Neither of us ever tried to figure out what or who was responsible for that night. To this day, the thought of that locked hatch and the sudden thud makes my skin crawl. A couple of months after our visit to the abandoned farm, Leon and I noticed something strange. The entire property had been blocked off. The driveway was barricaded, and signs warning against trespassing had been posted around the perimeter. Curious, we tried searching online for any news about the property, but there wasn't a single mention of it anywhere. No reports, no public announcements, nothing. It was as if the closure had been quietly swept under the rug. The whole situation left us with more questions than answers. Why had the house and barn been so abruptly shut off? Had someone discovered something there after our visit? We couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with dread. The thought of what might have been lurking on that property haunted us. If we had stayed any longer that night, or tried to investigate the locked cellar, we might never have left at all. The late-night food delivery gone wrong. This happened last fall, late in the season as winter approached. Where I live, it's not uncommon to see snow as early as October, and that night was no exception. I had been working as a food delivery driver for 3 years, and it started out as a typical shift. By around 11 p.m., light snow began to fall, and by 1 a.m., it had picked up considerably. The streets were quiet, with only a handful of cars venturing out in the worsening weather. Despite this, I kept getting orders, one after the other, until I finally decided to take one last delivery. The order was from a McDonald's and was only about 10 minutes from where I was, but I quickly realized it was in the opposite direction from my house. Already exhausted and 25 minutes from home, I felt annoyed with myself for not paying closer attention. As I drove, I noticed the plows hadn't been out yet, leaving the roads slippery. My SUV handled well in the snow, but the route became increasingly strange. The map led me to a remote road I didn't even realize had houses on it. It was the kind of road people usually took to access the highway leading out of state, not one you'd expect to find homes on. The road narrowed, flanked by tall trees that loomed close to the edges. I slowed down, worried about sliding off into the forest. After a few minutes, the GPS directed me to turn onto a driveway that seemed just like the others, long, snow-covered, and barely visible in the dark. At the end of the driveway stood a medium-sized, older house, blanketed in snow. It looked ordinary, except for how isolated it was. I parked, grabbed the food bag, and trudged through the thick snow toward the front porch. As I reached the door and knocked, the door swung open almost immediately. A tall man wearing a winter jacket stood there, his pale face stark against the shadows. "Hi, I've got your order right here," I said, holding up the bag. The man said nothing at first, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "You can set it down right over there," he said, motioning toward what I assumed was the kitchen. His tone was firm, almost demanding, but I knew going inside was a terrible idea. I hesitated, glancing at his hands. They were empty, which only made his request seem stranger. "Sorry, but I really have to get going," I said nervously, holding the bag out again. His expression darkened, and without another word, he slammed the door shut. Still holding the bag, I stood there for a moment, stunned. Shaking it off, I set the bag on the porch and began walking back to my car. As I crossed the yard, I heard a muffled sound coming from the side of the house. Turning, I saw movement, a shadow emerging from around the corner. It was the man, moving quickly toward me. In his hands was what looked like rope, though there was something else I couldn't make out. Panic gripped me as I ran to my car, adrenaline surging. I jumped in and started the engine just as the man reached the driveway. My tires struggled to gain traction on the snowy ground, but I reversed as quickly as I could. The man kept coming, getting within a few feet of the car before I managed to pick up speed. As I backed down the driveway, he stopped and watched, his figure slowly disappearing into the dark as I reached the road. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I still don't know what his intentions were, but I can't stop thinking about how close I came to something terrible. Now, I'm much more cautious when delivering food. I rarely knock anymore, opting to leave orders on the porch and leave quickly. Had I stayed even a moment longer that night or stepped inside his house, I might not be here to share this story. A chilling encounter in the woods. This happened several years ago, during early October. I had taken 2 weeks off work and rented a remote cabin on Airbnb in the hills outside my city. The location was perfect for what I wanted, a quiet, secluded getaway where I could relax and spend a few nights camping. The drive to the cabin took about 2 hours, and I arrived in the early afternoon. The place was surrounded by dense woods with no other structures in sight, offering the isolation I was looking for. Inside, the cabin was cozy but had an old-fashioned charm. While not entirely my style, it was a welcome change for a short vacation. For the first 4 days, I settled into a routine of relaxing outside during the crisp fall afternoons and enjoying the warmth of the fireplace in the evenings. Nothing unusual happened, and I appreciated the solitude. On the 5th day, I packed my camping gear and set out on the only trail connected to the cabin. I planned to camp for 2 or 3 nights, depending on how things went. The trail wound through the forest, and after 3 or 4 hours of walking, I found a small clearing just off the path. It seemed like the best spot to set up camp, as I didn't feel comfortable pitching my tent directly on the trail itself. By the time the sun began to set, I had my tent pitched and a fire going. The air grew colder quickly, so I bundled up in a heavy sweater and jacket and sat by the fire, eating a simple meal. As I stared into the flames, I noticed something odd in the distance, a figure moving among the trees. It was hard to make out much detail in the dim light, but the person was walking without a flashlight or any visible source of light. They weren't on the trail, but instead weaving through the forest, moving quietly until they disappeared into the darkness. A wave of unease washed over me. The idea of someone wandering through the woods, not using a trail or light, was strange and unsettling. For a moment, I considered packing up and hiking back to the cabin, but the idea of navigating the trail at night seemed even more dangerous. I decided to stay put, but remained on high alert, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. For the next half hour, I didn't see or hear anything else. Eventually, the exhaustion from the long day started to catch up with me. I let the fire burn down to embers, intending to get some rest. As soon as the last glow of the fire faded, I heard footsteps. They were coming from the left side of my campsite, slow but deliberate. My heart raced as I strained to see through the darkness, but the faint moonlight only illuminated a small area. The footsteps grew louder, approaching the campsite, but staying just outside the clearing. Whoever it was seemed to deliberately skirt the edges of my sight, remaining out of sight before moving away into the woods. That was enough for me. The chances of someone randomly passing by my exact location seemed impossible, and the whole situation felt wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and quickly packed up my gear, deciding it was safer to walk the trail back to the cabin than stay the night. The hike back was nerve-wracking. The woods were eerily silent, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. Every sound I made seemed amplified in the quiet, heightening my anxiety. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the cabin. Exhausted from the long day, I collapsed on the couch and fell asleep almost instantly, too drained to dwell on what had happened. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I couldn't place it. Something was scraping against the wooden exterior of the cabin. I froze, trying to listen, and heard it again, this time more distinctly. Turning toward the back of the room, I saw movement at the window. My heart dropped as I realized someone was pushing it open. A man's face came into view, and his eyes locked onto mine as I stood up in shock. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, he dropped the window and bolted into the woods. By the time I reached the window, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. I didn't wait to find out if he would return. Adrenaline coursing through me, I gathered my belongings, jumped in my car, and drove to the nearest town. I checked into a hotel and spent the rest of my trip there, unwilling to return to the cabin. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. What terrifies me most is the thought that he might have followed me all the way from the campsite to the cabin. If I hadn't woken up in time, I shudder to think what could have happened. The Halloween intruder. It was just a couple of days before Halloween, and I was looking forward to enjoying my time off work. After picking up some fast food on the way home, I planned to settle in for a relaxing night. I ate on the couch while watching Netflix, savoring the peace and quiet. About 30 minutes into the show, I paused it to throw away the leftovers. As I walked into the kitchen, I happened to glance out the back window and froze in place. Someone was standing in my backyard, motionless, just staring at my house. My yard is small and fully fenced, so there was no way he just wandered in by accident. A sense of unease crept over me as I flipped on the porch light and slid the back door open slightly. "Hey, what are you doing?" I called out, my voice sharp with nerves. The porch light illuminated his face, revealing a young man in his 20s with tired, hollow eyes. For a moment, he didn't respond or move, but when I repeated myself, he finally turned and walked casually toward the gate. I rushed to the front window to make sure he left. I watched as he strolled down the street, disappearing into the distance. Once he was gone, I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Why was he there? What could he have been looking at? Curiosity got the better of me, and I went out to the spot where he had stood. From there, I looked back at the house, trying to see what might have caught his attention, but there was nothing unusual. Feeling unsettled, but unsure what else to do, I went back inside, poured myself a drink, and returned to my show, determined to forget about it. About 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps running through the backyard, followed by a loud thud against the house. My heart leaped into my throat as I bolted to the kitchen. There he was again, now at my back door, pressing his body against it and violently trying to pull it open. His face, once blank and tired, was now contorted in rage, his wild eyes locking onto mine as I stepped closer. Panicking, I grabbed the door handle to hold it shut, despite the lock already being in place. My hand trembled as I looked into his crazed expression. Then, realizing I couldn't stop him if he got through, I backed away and grabbed my phone to call the police. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, the man suddenly stopped. He stood there, breathing heavily, his gaze still fixed on me through the glass. Then, without warning, he walked back toward the gate. I thought he might leave, but instead, he disappeared to the side of the house as if hiding. Terrified, I moved from window to window, trying to keep track of him while waiting for the police. Minutes passed in tense silence. Just as the patrol car pulled up outside, I heard footsteps again. This time, he wasn't running away. Instead, he ran back toward the door, yanking at it furiously in one last attempt to get inside. The officers caught him in the act. After a brief struggle, they subdued him, cuffed him, and placed him in the patrol car. Later, they told me he was heavily under the influence of some kind of drug, which was confirmed by tests. Despite being questioned both that night and in the days after, the man never provided any explanation for his actions. I still think about the way he stared at me through the glass and the rage in his eyes. What was his plan if he had managed to break in? Was it just the drugs, or was there something more sinister behind his persistence? The man was only imprisoned for a short time, and I've spent the past 2 years wondering if he might ever come back. The silent camper. 2 years ago, I decided to go camping for the first time. I was living with my younger brother on the East Coast, near the Appalachian Mountains. We didn't get out much, but I wanted to try something new. So I bought some basic camping gear and chose a nearby trail for a quick overnight trip. The trail was an hour's drive away. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty, and I didn't see anyone else. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown, clearly not a popular route. After hiking for about an hour, I reached the end of a small, secluded camping area surrounded by woods. It was overgrown, but what caught my attention was a pile of half-burned logs on the far side of the site. The logs looked like they had been used for a campfire recently, perhaps even the night before. Despite this, there was no sign of anyone else, no tents or gear. I set up my tent at the opposite end of the site and spent the remaining daylight eating and relaxing. As the sun set, I noticed the faint crackle of a fire. When I stepped out of my tent, I saw an older man sitting by the pile of logs, which he had reignited. He didn't have any gear, no tent, no backpack, nothing. Feeling uneasy, I waved at him. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his hand in response. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I glanced over, he was just sitting there, staring into his fire. Where had he come from? Eventually, I convinced myself I was overthinking it and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. The faint crackling of his fire and my lingering unease kept me awake. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. My breath caught as I saw the shadow of a man through the fabric. He stood there silently, unmoving, for what felt like forever. Then, without a word, he walked away, the sound of crunching leaves fading into the distance. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The man and his fire were gone. The logs still smoldered, but the site was otherwise empty. Terrified, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left, not caring about the broken tent rods or the mess I left behind. I don't know who that man was, where he came from, or what he wanted, but I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I had stayed. Story: a strange encounter in the woods not more than a week or two ago. I decided to hike into the dense woods behind my small town for an overnight camping trip. My town is tiny, with fewer than 1,000 residents, so it's surrounded by vast stretches of quiet wilderness. These woods are flat and expansive, dotted with ponds and small rivers. I had visited one of these rivers a few times before, but this was my first chance to camp there. I knew it was about a 3-hour walk north through unmarked woods. The hike was peaceful, with the only sounds coming from birds and the occasional rustling of leaves by small animals. There were no trails, and I didn't expect to see anyone. About 45 minutes from the river, however, I encountered someone. We were both walking toward each other, neither of us noticing the other until we were just a few feet apart, separated by only a couple of trees. I felt confused and a bit uneasy. It's not every day you meet someone deep in the woods with no trails around. The man appeared just as startled, giving me a nervous look. I was about to greet him when his expression shifted to a faint, awkward smile. Without saying a word, he turned and walked off to the side. I continued on my way, but after a few steps, I glanced back and saw him again. He wasn't walking anymore, he was running. Something about his behavior unsettled me. It was as though he wanted to avoid being seen, which made the encounter feel even stranger. Shrugging it off, I pressed on, reaching the river just before sunset. It wasn't a designated campsite, but I found a flat area to set up my tent and build a fire. I gathered twigs and branches, ensuring it would burn for a few hours. I had planned to stargaze, as the woods outside town offer a perfect view of the Milky Way. Hours passed as I sat by the fire, waiting for the stars to emerge. It was quiet and serene, until the moment I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and deliberate. My heart began to race as I turned, peering into the dark woods. The footsteps stopped. Whoever was out there could see me, but I couldn't see them. I reached into my bag and grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, sweeping its beam across the trees. The light pierced the darkness, but I saw nothing. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone there?" The woods remained silent. After a moment, I decided to investigate, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Holding the flashlight steady, I carefully moved toward where I had heard the sound. I shone the beam around, illuminating the base of each tree. Then, the light fell on someone. It was the man I had encountered earlier. He stood no more than 20 feet away, partially obscured by the trees. Despite the flashlight on him, he remained completely still. My instincts screamed at me to stay calm. Pretending I hadn't seen him, I slowly swept the flashlight away and began walking back to my tent, acting as though I was unbothered. Once at the campsite, I grabbed my bag, took one last look around, and left my tent and fire behind. Walking along the riverside, I kept moving until I was far enough from the campsite. Then I sprinted as fast as I could, not stopping until I was certain I had put a safe distance between myself and the man. I found a spot to rest and sat awake until sunrise, too terrified to sleep. Thankfully, I neither saw nor heard the man again. I never went back to retrieve my tent or other belongings. The fear of encountering him again and discovering why he had been lurking near my campsite was enough to keep me away. Story: a harrowing encounter on the road not long ago. I was on a cross-country haul from the East Coast to the far West Coast. Having been a truck driver for almost 20 years, I've taken this route countless times. It's a routine journey, same highways, truck stops, and scenery, with nothing particularly unusual ever happening. That night, about 20 hours into the drive, the weather took a turn. A heavy storm rolled in, slowing my progress and making visibility poorer. It was late, and I had already planned to stop at the next truck stop to rest. As I drove through the downpour, a sudden light appeared in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was another vehicle coming up behind me, but it was strange I hadn't seen their approach on the flat, straight road. The car was suddenly just there. Their headlights were glaring as they sped up and got alarmingly close to the back of my trailer. I kept an eye on them in my mirror, but before I could make sense of their actions, their headlights abruptly shut off. Now, in the middle of a storm on an isolated road, I had no way to tell if they were still following. It was unsettling. Turning off headlights in such dangerous conditions was reckless, if not outright insane. Thankfully, a sign appeared, indicating a truck stopped 5 miles ahead. I kept my focus on the road, glancing back occasionally, but the darkness and heavy rain made it impossible to tell if the car was still there. My thoughts raced, considering the possibility of an attempted robbery. Late-night trucking in remote areas carries risks, and I'd heard enough stories to know not to take chances. As I pulled into the truck stop, the lot appeared mostly empty, aside from a few trucks at the pumps. I parked in the middle of the lot, trying to scan my mirrors for any sign of the car, but the rain made it nearly impossible to see. After a minute, I opened the door to step out and check. The rain drenched me instantly, and I quickly glanced along the side of my trailer. There was no sign of the car, and I felt a wave of relief. I locked the truck, grabbed my blanket and pillow, and settled in for the night, letting the rhythmic pounding of rain on the roof lull me to sleep. What felt like just minutes later, I was startled awake by a loud thud against the truck. My heart raced as I sat up, trying to gather my bearings. Outside, the storm was still raging, and visibility was minimal. Peering through the rain-slicked window, I could barely make out the shape of a car at the back of my trailer. Its headlights were off, but the figures were moving around in the shadows. I froze, unsure whether to confront them or stay inside. Then, before I could act, my door slammed inward, shoving me back into the driver's seat. A man stood outside, yelling at me to stay put while slamming the door again for emphasis. His right hand was buried in his hoodie, and his aggressive demeanor left no doubt he could be armed. Behind the truck, I could hear the other two men moving around. The trailer shook slightly as they seemed to be tampering with it. My hands gripped the seat, and I forced myself to remain calm, knowing I was outnumbered and in no position to act impulsively. The man outside my door didn't take his eyes off me for a second. His stare was intense, unrelenting. Minutes dragged by, though it felt like hours. Suddenly, the men ran back to their car, and it sped off into the night. Still shaking, I watched their vehicle disappear onto the road before grabbing my phone to call the police. Despite filing a report and providing as much detail as I could, the authorities couldn't identify the men or their intentions. Looking back, I realize how close I came to a much worse outcome. If I had panicked or tried to drive off, there's no telling what might have happened. This incident left me with a newfound sense of vigilance. Even after 20 years on the road, I now approach every stop and every encounter with far greater caution. A Friday night delivery gone wrong. It was a regular Friday night, and I was out doing DoorDash to earn extra cash while juggling college life. The night started strong, with back-to-back orders during the dinner rush, but things slowed down significantly afterward. Most of the orders that came through were either too far or paid too little to be worth it. After about an hour of aimless driving, I got a notification for an order that was somewhat far 8 miles away but paid decently enough. I accepted it, picked up the food, and started driving. The app estimated it would take about 30 minutes, the longest delivery I'd ever done. The drive started like any other, with houses and buildings gradually thinning out as I moved away from the campus area. By the 20-minute mark, I was driving through stretches of empty farmland with few houses scattered far apart. The silence and isolation of the road felt unsettling, but I pressed on, eager to complete the order. When I finally arrived, I saw a narrow dirt driveway leading through a field to a small house in the distance. The eerie quiet made me uneasy, and as I drove closer, the only sound was the crunch of my car tires on the dirt. I parked in front of the house, leaving the engine running. The house looked dark and dilapidated, with only a porch light illuminating the overgrown grass and decaying wood. Bag in hand, I approached the door, knocked, and waited. No response. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no answer. Standing on the porch, I began to notice just how rundown the house was. There were no visible lights inside, and the windows were grimy and cracked. Something about the situation felt off. The only reason I didn't leave immediately was the porch light. It suggested someone might actually be home. Then I looked closer and noticed the light fixture was solar-powered. It didn't require anyone to be there to turn it on. As the realization hit me, a rumbling sound broke the silence behind me. I turned around to see a car driving up the dirt path toward my parked vehicle. Its headlights cut through the darkness, and as it stopped just behind my car, a man stepped out. "Is this your order?" I called from the porch, trying to sound confident despite my growing unease. The man didn't respond. He just stood by his car, staring at me without moving. My heart raced. The silence of the night made the situation feel even more sinister. I was alone in the middle of a field, caught between an empty house and a stranger who wasn't saying a word. Instinct took over. I dropped the food and bolted off the porch, running behind the house and into the tall grass. As I sprinted, I glanced back and saw the man following me. The further I ran, the taller and denser the grass became, eventually obscuring everything around me. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath and remain quiet. I couldn't hear him anymore, and hoped the grass had hidden me well enough. After what felt like an eternity, I reached another property and found a road where I could finally call for help. The police arrived and escorted me back to my car, but by then, the man was gone. Strangely, my car and the bag of food on the porch were untouched. It was clear the man's intentions weren't robbery, which made the situation all the more terrifying. A late-night warning at a gas station when I was 18. I embarked on a solo road trip to my new college. It was my first time traveling such a long distance alone, and my nerves were high. The drive was around 600 miles, and I had split it into 2 days with an overnight stay at a hotel. As the sun set and traffic thinned out, the open road became increasingly monotonous. Around 10 p.m., I decided to stop at the next gas station to refuel before the final stretch to the hotel. The station I pulled into was isolated, just a small building with a few pumps and no other cars in sight. There weren't even nearby houses or streetlights, just endless darkness surrounding the lot. As I stepped out to pump gas, I noticed a man walking toward me. He looked to be in his 50s, with a disheveled appearance that made him seem homeless. His sudden approach startled me, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. "Hi, do you need something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral but firm. The man stopped a few feet from my car, glancing around nervously before finally speaking. "Take the exit back onto the highway," he said. Confused, I asked why, but he didn't elaborate. He repeated the warning, then turned and walked away into the night. The encounter left me shaken. His tone wasn't aggressive, but the urgency in his voice made me feel like I needed to leave immediately. I quickly finished refueling, got back in my car, and drove away. Even now, I don't know what the man meant or what danger he might have been warning me about. All I know is that I'm glad I listened and didn't stick around to find out. The eerie warning and the ambush on the highway, I stared at the man, trying to process what he had just said. He pointed again at the exit I'd come from and repeated, "Take the exit back onto the highway." His words didn't make sense. The exit he was referring to was a one-way road leading off the highway, not back onto it. For me to follow his instructions, I'd have to drive against traffic to make a U-turn completely illegal and unsafe. I glanced at the proper entrance to the highway, the one I was supposed to take. It looked perfectly fine, with no signs of construction or any other issues. My instincts told me the man's warning was bizarre, perhaps even malicious. As I put the gas pump back and got into my car, I stole one last glance at him. He had settled against the side of the convenience store, sitting in the dim light. The more I thought about his odd behavior, the more uneasy I felt. Was this some kind of setup? Trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, I decided to stick with common sense and take the proper highway entrance. I merged onto the ramp and noticed something unusual immediately. None of the streetlights were on. The highway was pitch black except for my headlights illuminating a short stretch of road ahead. I slowed down, trying to be cautious. My eyes darted around, looking for any signs of construction or obstacles. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint silhouette on the side of the road. Before I could fully register what it was, a pickup truck swerved out of nowhere and stopped directly in front of me. My heart leapt into my throat as the truck's doors flung open, and 4 men jumped out. Each was armed. Metal bats, machetes, and knives gleamed in the faint light from my car's beams. They moved quickly, closing the gap between us with chilling determination. Their faces were completely bare, showing no emotion, like this was just another routine for them. I reacted on instinct, slamming my car into reverse as they neared my windows. My tires screeched as I backed up, heart pounding in pure panic. Just as I thought I might have created some distance, my headlights caught something even more horrifying. From the shadows lining the highway, dozens of figures emerged. They moved in sync, as if they'd been waiting for this exact moment. A few even started running toward my car, their silhouettes dark and menacing. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I twisted the wheel, turned my car around, and sped off in the opposite direction as fast as I could. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone and called 911. I reported everything I'd seen and begged them to send help. The operator assured me they'd investigate, but oddly enough, I never heard back. No follow-up, no confirmation. It was as if the entire incident had been swept under the rug. In hindsight, the man at the gas station hadn't been trying to trap me, he'd been trying to warn me. He must have known something about what was waiting ahead, and his cryptic advice was likely his way of steering me away from danger. Even now, I shudder to think about what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. The memory of those emotionless faces and the sheer number of people emerging from the shadows is something I'll never forget. Whatever their intentions were, I was lucky to get out alive. A cold, rainy night turned unnerving. It was just a few months ago, near the end of winter. I was spending my weekend indoors, enjoying the last chilly days before spring. The evening was cold and rainy, a perfect excuse to stay in, relax, and watch a few movies. After dinner, as I was getting comfortable, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I got up cautiously and peeked through the peephole. A man in a brown jacket and a beanie stood there, holding a snow shovel, a strange sight, considering there was no snow outside. I cracked the door just enough to ask what he wanted. His response immediately set off alarm bells. He stumbled over his words, rambling about being a friendly guy looking for yard work. Something about his tone and body language felt off, unnatural. "No, thanks," I said quickly, and I started closing the door. Before it shut, he placed his hand on it, holding it open just slightly. For a brief, tense moment, he stared at me through the gap. Then, without a word, he removed his hand and walked away, disappearing into the misty rain. I locked the door and looked out the window, watching to ensure he had left for good. He seemed to vanish down the sidewalk, swallowed by the fog and rain. Feeling uneasy, but rationalizing that he was probably just moving on to the next house, I tried to put it out of my mind and went back to my movie. The rain intensified over the next hour. I had started another movie, though I was struggling to stay awake. My eyelids grew heavy as the sound of raindrops became almost hypnotic. Suddenly, a loud thump startled me awake. The noise had come from above me. It was a single, distinct sound, loud enough to stand out over the storm. I tried to brush it off as something harmless, like a gutter coming loose in the heavy rain, but curiosity got the better of me. I went upstairs to check, scanning for anything that might have fallen or shifted. I even checked the ceilings for leaks. Nothing seemed out of place, so I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Feeling more awake now, I returned downstairs and finished my movie. By the time the credits rolled, it was close to midnight. I turned off the TV and began shutting down the house, switching off lights as I prepared for bed. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed something peculiar. The air grew noticeably colder with each step. At first, I thought it might be the weather outside, but it felt too sudden, too localized. When I reached the top, I began closing the doors to the rooms I'd checked earlier. That's when I noticed one of the bedroom windows was cracked open. I froze, staring at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing to process how it could have happened. I was certain all the windows had been locked earlier. Approaching cautiously, I examined it closer. The window opened onto a small overhang, and as I leaned in, I saw something chilling, a faint, witchy print on the windowsill. My heart raced as dread set in. Someone had been or was still in the house. I turned around slowly, straining to hear over the steady rhythm of the rain. The creaks and groans of the house suddenly felt ominous, each one making my skin crawl. I began inching back toward the hallway, careful not to make a sound. All the other doors remained ajar, their darkened interiors now feeling menacing. It was as if someone could be watching me from within the shadows of any one of them. I paused, holding my breath and listening, trying to determine if I was truly alone. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. I managed to make it downstairs, my heart pounding with every step. Once there, I grabbed my phone and ducked into the garage, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, explaining in a hushed voice that someone had broken into my home. The operator assured me help was on the way, but those 5 minutes felt like an eternity. The only sound was the rain drumming against the garage roof, masking any noise that might have come from inside the house. When the first officer arrived, I let him in and stayed on the porch, unwilling to go back inside. Rain soaked through my clothes as I stood there, but I barely noticed. Minutes later, I heard the officer shout from upstairs. He came down shortly after, escorting a man in handcuffs. My stomach turned as I recognized the intruder. It was the man who had been at my doorstep earlier that evening. He glared at me with a look of pure anger as he was led past and into the squad car. The officer pieced everything together as he explained what had happened. The man had climbed onto my roof, which was likely the source of the thump I'd heard earlier in the night. From there, he accessed a second-story window that I hadn't thought to lock. Even more disturbing was that he had removed his shoes before entering, presumably to avoid leaving footprints on the carpet. The faint shoe imprint I'd noticed on the window sill had been my only clue without it. I might not have even realized he was there until it was too late. Most horrifying was where the officer found him, hiding in my master bedroom. That was the very room I was planning to enter before retreating downstairs. I had been mere seconds away from walking into a room with him lying in wait. His intent was clear, and it was far from innocent. Thankfully, the judge later agreed, and he was sentenced to prison. In the months since, I've installed cameras, replaced locks, and made sure every window in my house stays securely locked. Despite these precautions, I still have sleepless nights where I imagine someone lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. Gas location. A couple of years ago, I took a temporary job at a local gas station. It wasn't ideal, but I was planning to move in 6 months and needed a job to save up some money. The overnight shift was available, and while it wasn't glamorous, the pay was decent enough. My responsibilities were straightforward: manning the register and doing occasional maintenance. By my 4th month, I'd come to recognize some of the regulars, including a man named Dave. He would show up almost every night around 1 or 2 a.m., buying out assortments of items, tools, snacks, or random household supplies. What always struck me as peculiar was how he chose to buy things that could have been found cheaper at a grocery store. He never talked much, only ever giving his first name, and I knew he drove an old red Chevy sedan. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a rugged and slightly disheveled appearance. One night, as usual, Dave pulled into the lot just after 1 a.m. The station was quiet, with no other customers around. He walked in, but something was off. He was sweating profusely, his shirt clinging to him as he rushed through the aisles, seemingly searching for something specific. When he reached the counter, he slammed a master lock onto it. It was the kind you'd use for securing a bike. Trying to keep things light, I said, "Hey, Dave, got yourself a new bike?" He didn't respond. His hands fumbled as he pulled cash from his wallet, his expression frantic. I rang up the lock and watched as he hurried out to his car and drove off. Something about the encounter made me uneasy, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he really had just bought a bike and was in a rush to secure it somewhere. Days passed, and I didn't see Dave again, which was unusual given his almost nightly visits. Then, a week later, during a drizzly Wednesday shift, his red car pulled into the lot. He stepped out quickly, entering the store with the same tense demeanor as before. This time, he ignored my greeting entirely, muttering under his breath as he wandered the aisles. His behavior unsettled me, and a knot formed in my stomach. While I kept an eye on him, a loud thud came from outside. My gaze snapped to the window, where I could see Dave's car. It sounded like something had hit the inside of his trunk. My eyes darted back to him, and I froze. Dave had stopped moving. He stood in the middle of an aisle, staring directly at me. His eyes were cold, and his expression was unreadable. The intensity of his gaze sent a wave of panic through me. Then, without a word, He looked away and bolted out the door. Shaken, I managed to grab my phone and snap a picture of his license plate as he drove off. I called the police immediately, explaining everything to the dispatcher. That night felt endless as I waited for updates, but it wasn't until the following morning that I got a call. The police had tracked down the car and arrested Dave. To my horror, they also found a woman in his trunk, bound and terrified but alive. She had been kidnapped and was being held at a remote cabin on the outskirts of town that Dave had recently moved into. The cabin was so new that it wasn't even registered, which had made it nearly impossible to track him before this incident. Thankfully, the woman was rescued before any further harm could come to her. As for Dave, I learned that wasn't even his real name. Whatever he had planned for that night was interrupted, and now he's locked up for good. Even though the situation was resolved, it left a lasting impact on me. I'll never forget the look on his face that night, or the realization of how close I was to being another victim. Some nights when the station is quiet, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't taken that photo of his license plate. Room: I was 14 when this happened, during spring break. My parents' anniversary fell in the same week, so they went on a date night a few hours north, staying at a hotel. Having the house to myself for the first time, I invited my friend Justin to spend the night. He came over with an arsenal of snacks and sodas, and we set up in the basement. The PlayStation was ready to go, and we cranked up the speakers for a long night of gaming. For about 3 hours, it was nothing but laughter, yelling at the screen, and chugging sodas. Then Justin got up to get a glass of water. When he came back, his face was pale, and he looked genuinely unsettled. "There's someone outside," he whispered. I thought he was messing with me, but he insisted he saw a person standing in the backyard near the sliding glass door by the kitchen. His tone convinced me he wasn't joking. We both went upstairs to check it out. At first, we didn't see anything, but then we noticed faint smudges on the outside of the glass door. They were at about head height, like someone had been leaning against the glass and peering inside. The realization sent chills down my spine. I immediately shut the blinds, and Justin and I went around checking all the windows to make sure they were locked. Everything seemed secure, and we didn't spot anyone lurking around. As to 14-year-olds, we weren't exactly equipped to deal with something like this, but we convinced ourselves it was just some random person passing by. We went back downstairs to continue gaming. Hours flew by, and it was deep into the night, probably around 2 or 3 a.m. when we finally decided to wrap up. Justin, tired from the night, flopped onto one of the 2 small couches in the basement, while I took the other. We turned off the lights, laid out our blankets, and tried to sleep. For some reason, I couldn't stay asleep. I dozed off for a few minutes, only to jolt awake again. It went on like this for what felt like hours. I chalked it up to the caffeine, but there was something off about the way I kept waking up. The last time I opened my eyes, I noticed something strange. A faint streak of light cutting across the far end of the basement. I sat up, squinting to figure out where it was coming from. It was the door at the top of the staircase. It was cracked open slightly, and light from the hallway upstairs was spilling into the darkness. I looked over at Justin. He was still sound asleep on the other couch. My first thought was that Justin might have gotten up for more water at some point, but I hadn't heard a thing. The uneasy feeling in my stomach grew as I got up and approached the staircase. The closer I got, the more I realized the door wasn't just ajar. It looked like someone had nudged it open recently. I climbed the stairs cautiously and pushed the door further open. The hallway light was on, and so was the kitchen light. That's when I remembered Justin's earlier warning about someone in the backyard. My heart pounded as I walked toward the kitchen to look out the glass door. The backyard appeared empty under the dim glow of the porch light, but just as I was about to turn away, I saw something move, a shadow flickering across the reflection on the glass. I froze, then spun around. Down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone had darted across the far end of the hallway, too fast for me to make out. My mind raced. I stood there, rooted in fear, before adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted back downstairs. I shook Justin awake, whispering frantically about what I saw. His face drained of color as I explained. Without a word, we both scrambled into one of the basement closets, closing the door quietly behind us. I called 911 as we crouched inside, trying not to breathe too loudly. While we waited, we could hear faint sounds of movement upstairs, footsteps pacing back and forth, doors creaking as they were opened and shut. It sounded like whoever was up there was frantically searching for something. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. Minutes felt like hours until we finally heard the police arrive. The sound of their voices calling out gave me the courage to emerge from the closet. I let them into the house, and they began their search. It wasn't long before one of the officers called out from upstairs. Moments later, he came down with a man in handcuffs, a man I immediately recognized. It was the person Justin had seen earlier in the backyard. The man glared at me as he was escorted past and into the patrol car. The officer explained that the small bolt lock on the back door had been snapped, which was how he'd gotten inside. Even more chilling, he had been hiding in the master bedroom likely for hours until they found him. The officer mentioned that the man had taken off his shoes after breaking in, which was why we hadn't heard him moving around earlier. The only reason I even suspected something was wrong was because of the faint shoe imprint on the window seal. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of that man. The idea that I had been seconds away from unknowingly walking into a room where he was hiding still gives me nightmares. After that night, my parents installed better locks and eventually a security camera system. The most disturbing part came later. Every few months, we began finding similar smudges on the sliding glass door. Someone had been pressing their face against it, looking in. We never saw anyone, but the evidence was there. After the security cameras were installed, the smudges stopped. It's been over a year now without any signs of them returning. But I still can't help but wonder what they wanted and if they'll ever come back. This past August, I had one of the scariest experiences of my life. It was a quiet Saturday evening, and I was home alone. My mom and sister were out shopping, and my dad was working late. I decided to spend the evening gaming with my friends Griffin and Broly to relax after a tough couple of weeks of school. Around 8 p.m., after burning a batch of pizza rolls, I finally logged on, but my friends didn't last long. After an hour of losses, they called it a night. Feeling bored and restless, I decided to lie down and scroll on my phone. That plan quickly changed when I heard my two dogs barking outside. It wasn't unusual for them to bark at people walking by, but something felt off. Curious, I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. Then I heard the garage door open and shut. This sound typically meant my dad was home, but his van wasn't in the driveway. He'd also texted earlier saying he'd be working late. Alarmed, I went downstairs to the dining room for a better look. The driveway was empty, and the street was silent. Uneasy, I ran back to my room and texted my family group chat. My mom told me to turn off the lights, lock my bedroom door, and wait until they returned. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard faint creaking from the wooden floor downstairs, like someone trying to move stealthily. Panic set in. I didn't have anything to defend myself with. Improvising, I unclipped the boom arm from my microphone and slowly opened my bedroom door. I crept to the upstairs balcony overlooking the living room and called out, "Is anybody there?" My voice echoed in the silence, but I wasn't ready for what happened next. A large silhouette appeared beneath the balcony. Standing completely still, my heart stopped. I bolted for the nearest room with a locking door, my small bathroom, and locked myself inside. Seconds later, loud, fast footsteps thundered up the stairs. My hands were trembling. I realized I'd left my phone in my bedroom, just a door away. Summoning all the courage I could, I sprinted out of the bathroom, locked myself in my bedroom, and grabbed my phone. Across the hall, my sister's room had its door open, a detail that sent chills down my spine because I hadn't touched it. As I turned to call 911, I noticed something horrifying. The storage closet embedded in my wall was ajar, and through the narrow gap, I saw an eye staring at me. Frozen with terror, I dropped everything and bolted downstairs, out the front door, and up the hill to my neighbor's house. My neighbor, a police officer, immediately called for backup while his wife stayed with me. Minutes later, I saw him heading down to my house with a flashlight. I stayed back, praying the intruder would be caught. When I returned, I saw my neighbor pinning a tall, skinny man with a gray beard and dirty black coat to the floor as he cuffed him. It was the same man I'd spotted earlier in the evening, lingering by the house. Apparently, he had climbed onto the roof, causing the thud I'd heard earlier. He managed to enter through an upstairs window, one I hadn't thought to lock. The most unsettling part, the man had been hiding in the storage closet in my room, waiting. My parents were horrified when they came home, but they were grateful I was unharmed and for our neighbor's bravery. Since then, my family installed a robust security system, and I'm never left home alone anymore. I wouldn't wish this kind of experience on anyone. Overnight shift. A couple of years ago, I was working an overnight shift as a manager at a mid-sized grocery store. Staffing issues had left us short-handed, so I was the only one working that night. It wasn't unusual to have the store to myself, but it did mean I had to juggle tasks quickly to keep everything on track. Around 2 a.m., as I worked on stocking the aisles, a tapping sound echoed through the store. I froze, listening as it came again. It sounded like someone tapping on the large glass windows at the front. Puzzled, I walked over and saw a man leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. He spotted me and stared, his expression unsettling. I approached cautiously and asked what he wanted. Without changing his blank demeanor, he demanded I open the door. I told him the store was closed and that he needed to leave. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang rattled the glass. I spun around to see him slamming his fist against the window, his face twisted with rage. Deciding not to take any chances, I pulled out my phone and warned him I'd call the police if he didn't leave. At that, he backed away into the parking lot, glaring as he disappeared into the darkness. Shaken, I tried to refocus on my work. The man seemed unhinged, but encounters with odd customers weren't entirely uncommon. The silence that followed, however, felt heavy. Half an hour later, I heard a faint shuffling sound near the back of the store. My stomach dropped. This area wasn't visible from where I was, but it led to the employee entrance, a door that wasn't as secure as the front. Grabbing my phone, I hurried to the back, heart pounding. When I reached the employee entrance, I saw that the door was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. Panic set in as I locked it and checked the surrounding area, but I saw no one. I stayed alert for the rest of the shift, my nerves on edge until daylight finally arrived. The man didn't return that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have been planning something. The experience was a stark reminder to never let my guard down, especially when working alone. I had only managed to stock a small cart of boxes when, about 15 minutes later, a sharp sound rang through the store. It sounded like metal snapping or scraping. Alarmed, I dropped what I was doing and rushed toward the front. There was nobody at the windows, so I moved to the entrance. The door was one of those revolving glass types, secured at night with a bolt lock at the top. But as soon as I looked, I saw the bolt wasn't just unlocked, it was completely gone. My stomach dropped. I pushed the door, and it spun freely, meaning anyone could have entered. Feeling the blood drain from my face, I realized how serious this was. I turned toward the office to call the police, but froze in my tracks. The man from earlier was standing just a few feet in front of me, his furious glare fixed on me. Without hesitation, I bolted through the revolving door, hearing his footsteps close behind. Once outside, an old van suddenly sped up to the entrance. It came so close that I thought it would hit me, but I didn't stop running. I made it to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. From inside, I saw the man retreating, and the van sped off out of the parking lot. Shaking, I called the police and spent the next couple of hours recounting the incident. The next day, security footage revealed the man breaking in, but the video quality was too poor to make out many details. It seemed likely they were trying to grab me and force me into that van. I'll never know their intentions, but I'm sure that if I hadn't acted so quickly, I might not have made it out alive. A few months ago, I was out driving for DoorDash, which I do as a side gig for about 10 to 15 hours a week. That night, I was only completing a few orders since it was already pretty late, and I had picked up a small order around 1 a.m. It was to be delivered to a business across town, which was clear from the address. This kind of thing is usually typical for late-night shifts, particularly for overnight workers. However, when I pulled into the parking lot, it was completely empty, no cars at all, and I noticed there didn't seem to be any parking at the back of the building either. I parked near the front and grabbed the food. The building appeared to be an office building, smaller than most, just 2 stories, and not very wide. All the lights were off, except for one behind the front door. I checked the app for drop-off instructions, which said I needed to go inside, walk to the main hallway, and leave the food outside of room 132. Looking through the door, I could see a hallway lined with closed doors, which seemed similar to deliveries I had made to hotels, so this wasn't exactly new to me. I tried the door and it was unlocked, so I stepped inside. I expected to hear people working or talking, but the building was eerily silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. As I passed the first few doors, I noticed they were all labeled with numbers in the 100s, like 102 and 106. Since the delivery instructions were for room 132, I assumed it was on the second floor. In the middle of the hallway, there was a doorway leading to the staircase, which was being held open by a doorstop on the floor, though the lights were off. I stepped in and walked up to the base of the stairs, only to find the stairwell completely dark. There was no light coming from above where the room I was delivering to was supposed to be. It was then that I began to feel an uncomfortable chill from the silence. I'm usually one to follow the instructions precisely for good reviews, but at that moment, I felt that something was off. I decided it wasn't worth it and stepped back out of the stairwell into the hallway. Just as I did, the door across from me opened. A man stepped out into the hallway, wearing street clothes that didn't look like office attire at all. He stood in front of me and pointed toward the stairs, telling me that room 132 was upstairs. I nodded but didn't move, and neither did he. He just stood there, staring at me with a look of barely contained anger. After an awkwardly tense few seconds, I quickly dropped the bag on the ground and started walking toward the exit. The man didn't follow me, but I could hear his footsteps as he walked toward the stairwell and headed up. I left the building, got in my car, and drove away, unsure of what had just happened. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, so I didn't report it to the police. The next day, though, the police called me. They said the office had reported a break-in, and they had tracked my car and license plate from the CCTV footage. They also had footage of the break-in itself and wanted to know if I had any information. I didn't have much to offer, but it turned out there were actually 3 men involved in the break-in. One was the man I had seen downstairs, but the others were shown on camera, waiting at the top of the stairs, likely expecting me to go up. It was disturbing to learn that several other delivery orders had been made to that same office that night. All the other drivers had been smarter than I was and had left their orders outside by the front door. What might have happened if I had gone upstairs is anyone's guess, but hopefully, the police will catch the 3 men before anyone else falls victim to whatever they were planning. In another story, I go camping with my dad every summer. He's been doing it his whole life, and recently, I've started joining him. I'm 16, and last year, my dad and I decided to go on our seasonal camping trip. We found a spot online while looking for a new camping area to try out. There were no pictures of the place, but the map was easy to follow, and the description said the trail was easy and uncrowded. We set off on a Friday morning, parked by the side of the road, and began walking down the trail. After the first quarter mile, it became clear that the description was misleading. The trail was pretty steep in places, and much of it was muddy or overgrown, making it much harder than we had expected. Despite that, we pushed on and eventually reached the campsite. It looked just like the rest of the woods we had been walking through for the past 2 hours, lots of trees and a patch of overgrown grass for us to set up our things on. There were no beautiful views or anything. We set up our tents and made lunch. My dad's a bit of a talker, so we spent the rest of the day chatting. Once the sun started to set, we walked around the trees near our campsite to gather dry sticks for a fire. In the middle of our conversation, we were suddenly interrupted by a loud voice behind us. We both froze, turning around quickly. The woods were unnervingly silent again, and we couldn't see anyone. The voice had sounded like it was not too far away, maybe a mile or so out. For about 30 seconds, neither of us spoke, just staring at the trees and trying to spot any movement. Then it came again, a man's voice, shouting in pain. The scream sent chills through me. It was so raw, filled with distress, like the person was in real trouble. I looked at my dad, and I could see the conflict and worry on his face. He turned me around and quickly led me back to the campsite, starting a fire as he did. The screams kept coming, though, and after a while, I asked him if we should help. I could tell he was considering all the possible outcomes. He looked me in the eyes, serious, and told me to stay by the fire and wait. He said he would run a little way toward the voice to see what he could find, and that if I saw anyone, I was to keep them away from me. I agreed and watched as he sprinted off toward the source of the cries. A minute later, he was out of sight. I wasn't sure what I would have done in my dad's shoes. Leaving someone in obvious distress would have felt terrible, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and who knew what could happen? After 10 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. The sun seemed to be setting faster, and there was still no sign of my dad. Then, suddenly, the screaming stopped. The entire forest was eerily quiet again. I wondered if my dad had found the person and was helping them, or if something else had happened. Another 10 minutes passed with no sign of my dad. As the darkness settled over the woods, my nerves began to build. I stood up, walked a little away from the campsite, and moved in the direction my dad had gone. There were no signs of him, so I kept walking. Finally, I heard footsteps from up ahead. I still couldn't see anything, but the sound of the steps growing louder made my skin crawl, an unsettling feeling creeping up on me. Just before I expected to see my dad, a voice called my name from the left. It was my dad, running toward me, urgently shouting for me to go back. The panic in his voice made me hurry back to the campsite. My dad was right behind me. He quickly packed the essentials into his backpack, and the fear on his face is something I will never forget. It was complete terror, a look of being completely undone. We left our tents behind and ran for the first mile, then fast-walked the rest of the way back to our car. During the drive home, I asked him what he had seen out there, who the man was, and why he had been screaming. My dad didn't say a word. To this day, he refuses to talk about it. Every time I bring it up, his face changes completely, and his demeanor goes blank. I stopped asking after a while. What haunts me now are those footsteps I heard, getting closer and closer. What would have happened if my dad hadn't shown up in time? That's something I'll never know. I was camping in a familiar part of the forest near my city. My city is small, and there's not much to do, so camping is something I really enjoy. I'm not a huge fan of hiking, though. I prefer the more relaxing aspects of camping, like sitting by a fire and having no responsibilities. The trail I took was one I had been on many times before. It was only a 30-minute walk from the parking area, and the campsite was right next to a lake. Since there aren't many people who camp in the area, I didn't expect to see anyone else. But when I arrived, there was already a man with a tent set up by the lake. He looked like he was in his 40s, wearing some generic swimming shorts and a stained white t-shirt. I walked a little farther from his tent and set up mine. After that, I collected some large stones from nearby to make a ring for the campfire I planned to light later. As I did this, I noticed the man watching me. It wasn't just a quick glance. He was standing by the lake, facing me, and staring intently. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked back, he was still there, standing in the same spot, watching me. It got creepy, so I waved at him to see if he wanted to say hello, but after I waved, he turned around and continued walking along the lake. That didn't sit well with me. It made me uncomfortable, and I started to get a strange feeling about him. I kept an eye on him for a while, but nothing happened. After about 20 minutes, he walked away from the lake and into the forest behind his tent. I figured he might have been walking around or following a trail, but I was just relieved he was gone for now. I moved my chair by the lake and relaxed, staying there for an hour or so before I picked it up and moved back to my tent. The sun was starting to set, so I lit my campfire and looked around the forest. That's when I spotted something in the distance. There was a shape next to one of the trees. I squinted to get a better look, and I realized it was the same man. He was standing far behind my campsite, staring in my direction. This was getting really creepy. How long had he been watching me? I moved my chair to the other side of the campfire so I could face him directly and keep an eye on him. He stayed there for a good 30 or 40 minutes, staring at me from the forest. Eventually, it started getting darker, and the shadows made it harder to see him. After a while, I could no longer make out his shape, but I knew he could still see me because my campfire lit up the area. The thought that he was out there, watching me, but I couldn't see him anymore made me really anxious. What was he doing? He had a tent, so he was clearly camping, but in the hours I had been there, I never saw him go back to it. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was worried that he might follow me if I did. So I sat by the fire, making sure it didn't go out, and just waited. Several long, tiring hours passed, and I didn't see anything else. He never came back to his tent, nor did he come close enough for me to see him again. When the sun came up, I looked around and saw no signs of him. I quickly packed up my gear and left for my car. It was hard to know what that guy's intentions were, but if I hadn't been cautious and stayed awake, who knows what could have happened. A few days later, I was camping again, this time in a forest a few hours from my town. I had set up camp at the end of a 4-hour trail. I had already spent the night there, and the next day, I noticed a narrow path leading out from the campsite. It wasn't on the map, and I had no idea where it went, but I had nothing better to do, so I decided to check it out. Maybe it led to a small pond or waterfall. I packed a backpack with food and water in case I ended up staying longer than expected. The trail was very thin, and it was clear that not many people had used it, at least not recently. The path was overgrown in places, and there were no signs of recent use like shoe prints. I walked for several miles, taking about 2 hours before I finally reached the end. It wasn't what I expected. There was a house, or rather, a cabin, sitting in the woods. It was clearly abandoned. Moss and vines were growing over the wooden siding, and all the doors and windows were open. Before going any further, I looked around, trying to assess the situation. The woods were unnervingly still and quiet. I approached the doorway and peeked inside. The front hallway was filled with dust and debris, but it was otherwise empty. As I ventured deeper into the cabin, the smell of mildew and rotting wood filled the air. The rooms were mostly barren, with little to see. Feeling uneasy, I was about to turn around and leave, but something caught my eye, a glimmer coming from one of the closed wooden doors. The handle had been ripped off, and instead, there was a shiny silver padlock on it. The padlock looked brand new, and it didn't match anything else in the house. My curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself wondering why there was a padlock on a door in such an empty, decaying cabin. The more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became, and that feeling quickly overpowered my curiosity. I decided not to investigate further and quickly left the cabin. As I stepped back onto the trail, I heard a single footstep from inside the house. I turned around and glanced at the doorway, but I saw nothing. I kept walking, trying to distance myself from the unsettling place. But as I walked, I started hearing footsteps again, this time seemingly following me. The dense trees made it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. I continued walking for about 2 hours, and when I finally returned to my camp, I immediately started a fire and sat by it, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. As the night went on, I started hearing the footsteps again, coming from far beyond the reach of my campfire's light. The sound would come every 10 to 15 minutes, but no matter how hard I tried, I never saw anyone. Eventually, the hours dragged on, and I knew I had to sleep, so I left the campfire burning as I crawled into my tent. I barely slept that night, waking at every small noise the woods made. The next morning, there was no sign of anyone around, so I packed up and left, unsure of who or what had followed me, but deeply disturbed by the experience. I'll never know what the person intended or why they were following me, but the thought of it still haunts me. The locked door in that cabin is something I can't stop thinking about, and I'll never know what might have been behind it. There's an abandoned hotel in my town that's been vacant for decades. It's been bought out a few times, but each time, the businesses that tried to run it went bankrupt within a few years. Our town is small and old-fashioned, so there's really no reason for anyone to visit unless they have family here. Despite that, the hotel was huge, at least 6 stories, making it the largest building in town. When I was 23, I decided to check it out, thinking there was nothing particularly dangerous or scary about it. It was just an empty building, and I thought it would be cool to walk around and explore. I decided to go during the day, figuring if anyone was there, they were probably just other curious explorers like me. I parked at a store half a mile away and walked to the hotel, which was mostly isolated since the stores around it had long been torn down. The hotel was in worse shape, and I remembered the brick was crumbling, and the whole place looked faded and decayed. I went up to the front and peeked inside. It was mostly empty, with just a few pieces of old furniture scattered around. I stepped inside and walked through the lobby, opening the door to the staircase. The stairwell was shadowed, with only a faint beam of light coming from one of the floors above. It barely lit the way, but it was enough to guide me up the stairs. When I reached the second floor, I found the door blocked. Something on the other side was preventing it from opening, and a sheet of wood was covering the window on the door. I left it and continued up to the 3rd floor, where I opened another door and entered the hallway. This floor was easily the creepiest setting I'd ever encountered. The hallway was dark and musty, with only small windows at each end providing minimal light. I walked down a bit and entered the first room with an open door. Oddly, it looked fairly normal. Dust had covered everything, but the furniture was arranged as if it had never been moved. Even towels and soap were left in the bathroom. As I stood there, I heard a faint thud. I turned to face the doorway, unsure whether the sound came from my floor or the one below. A few moments later, I heard quiet footsteps creaking on the floorboards, getting closer. I just stared at the doorway, hoping they weren't on my floor. After a few seconds, the footsteps stopped, followed by a door opening, and then slamming shut on the floor below me. After that, there was complete silence. I tried to stay calm, walking toward the hallway and checking for anyone else, but there was no one in sight. The more I thought about it, the more unnerving it seemed. Why would someone exploring the place move so deliberately to a room and then slam the door? I grew increasingly nervous, and the silence only added to the tension. After standing there for a minute, I decided I'd had enough. I quietly walked back to the staircase, opened the door, and started descending. The metal stairs were loud, each step echoing with a hollow thud. As I passed the door to the 2nd floor, I noticed a small gap in the doorway that hadn't been there before. I looked down at the stairs ahead and froze. A figure stood in the stairwell, only a few steps below me. They were barely visible in the darkness, but their eyes were staring right at me. With no other choice, I began to carefully walk along the edge of the staircase, keeping as quiet as possible. The figure's eyes never left me, following every step I took as I passed within a few feet of them. I made it to the bottom of the stairs, and without wasting any time, I opened the door and ran out into the lobby where I could finally see clearly. I hurried back to my car and sat there in the parking lot for a while, trying to process what had just happened. Looking back, I realized that it was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever done. I didn't fully understand what I had walked into, and I wasn't sure what the person in the hotel was doing or why they were there. But leaving when I did was probably the only smart decision I made. A few weeks later, I was driving back from my friend's place in Wisconsin. I live just outside of Chicago, which is about a 6-hour drive, so I decided to do it all in one go. However, I didn't anticipate leaving so late. I didn't hit the road until 8 p.m., but I had to be home for work the next day, so I couldn't afford to stay much longer. If you're not familiar with Wisconsin, it's mostly flat with a ton of forests in the northern parts and small towns scattered throughout. The bigger cities are closer to the border, far from where I was. My friend's place was in one of those small towns, so right from the start, it was just barren forest roads. A few cars passed by, but once I was 30 minutes out and the sun had set, there wasn't a single other car on the road. I probably went a full 2 hours without seeing anyone else, and the endless, flat forest on either side was making me sleepy. It certainly didn't help that I was exhausted from the weekend. I tried everything to stay awake, but around 11 p.m., I saw something up ahead. I rubbed my eyes and realized it was a person standing on the shoulder of the road with their thumb out, clearly looking for a ride. For some reason, the first thought that came to mind was that having company in the car might help keep me awake. Almost instinctively, I began slowing down. As I got closer, the person started walking toward my car. I rolled the window down and pulled up next to them. "Hey, I just need a ride into the next town if you've got a spare seat," the man said. It was really dark, and I couldn't see much of him, but his voice sounded tired. I let him into the back seat. It wasn't until I started pulling away that the thought crossed my mind. Why was he out here in the middle of the woods at this hour? I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him sitting in the back, staring at me from the shadows. He looked to be around 30, with stubble and a buzz cut, but I didn't see a backpack or anything with him. I asked, "So what brings you out here?" He answered with a straight face, then gave a fake smile. "Oh, I was just walking on a trail in the woods and got lost. Found the road and figured I'd catch a ride." I thought about his response for a second. I didn't know about any trails around here, and even if there were, he would have had to drive to get to this point. Why didn't he mention that he wanted to be dropped off at the trailhead instead of in town? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. But before I could say anything else, the man suddenly told me to pull over. "Stop here," he said. I cautiously did as he asked, pulling onto the shoulder and parking. We were about 5 miles from where I picked him up, and there was still nothing but dense forest all around. Without a word, the man opened the door and rushed away into the trees. I was freaked out and just wanted to leave, but as I leaned into the back seat to shut the door, I noticed a drawstring bag tucked under the passenger seat. It wasn't mine, it was definitely his. I called out to him, "Hey, you left your bag." He stopped, turned around, and stared at me with a frustrated look for several long, uncomfortable seconds. Then he came back, grabbed the bag abruptly, and rushed off into the woods without a word. I quickly shut the door and drove off, relieved to be away from him. But just a few minutes down the road, I started to notice an awful smell coming from the back seat. It got worse and worse over the next 30 minutes. By the time I reached a small town and stopped at a gas station, I used my phone's light to check the back seat. There, on the carpet under the passenger seat where the bag had been, was a deep red stain. I almost threw up as I rushed into the gas station and called the police. I gave them all the details about what happened, and they took a piece of the carpet from my car to have it tested. They also searched for the man, but came up empty, only finding a few footprints near where I had picked him up. I don't know exactly what was in that bag, but it seems like he was trying to plant it in my car as a way to cover something up. To this day, we still have no idea who he was or what he was up to that night. A few weeks later, I was working a quick DoorDash shift on a Monday night. I finished my day job at 7 p.m. and decided to make a few deliveries. It was a pretty regular, quiet night with nothing out of the ordinary. I completed about 7 or 8 orders before taking my last one for the night. After dropping off the last order, I started heading back to town, where my apartment was. It was around 10 p.m., and I was about 20 minutes outside town, driving through the farmlands that surrounded it. A couple of minutes into my drive, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, and the man moved over a little bit, but not enough to completely get out of my way. As I got closer, he looked right at me and stuck his thumb out. In my headlights, I could tell he was an older man, probably in his early 50s, with a large backpack on his shoulders. Since I was already slowing down, I figured I'd be helpful and offer him a ride into the city since I was headed that way. He leaned on the window sill and thanked me for stopping. His eyes looked heavy, like he hadn't slept in days, but he seemed nice enough, so I agreed to give him a ride. What I wasn't expecting, though, was for him to immediately open the passenger door and sit down next to me. It didn't matter much, but I felt like it was usually more courteous to sit in the back seat. As he settled in, I looked past him at the field of tall grass where he seemed to have come from. "You from around here?" "What brings you out to the farmlands?" I asked. He looked over at me and said, "Just making my way across the country to visit my family. Don't have a car, so I've been hitching rides." I thought that was interesting and asked more about where he was from, but he gave me vague and uninterested answers. A few times, I noticed him looking into the back seat, not just quick glances, but more like he was scanning it, looking for something. Something about him started to feel off. He wasn't talking much, and his behavior was just unusual. "Is everything okay?" I asked. I still had my eyes on the road, but he didn't answer. When I looked over at him, I saw his disturbing stare, and that's when I noticed the knife clenched in his right hand. "Stop the car," he demanded. I didn't say a word and parked right in the middle of the road. I was terrified and figured that if I just let him take whatever he wanted, I might get out unharmed. As soon as the car was in park, I turned to open my door, but he quickly stopped me. "Get in the back," he ordered, still clutching the knife. I froze for a moment, realizing we were in the middle of empty fields, and if I got in the back, I might never have another chance to escape. That's when I noticed his large backpack was slightly open by his feet, revealing a thick bundle of rope. I had no choice but to try and escape now, before it was too late. I opened the door and jumped out in one swift motion. The man tried to jump across the front seat to grab me, but I sprinted to the other side of the road and into the tall grass. I kept running until I felt like he couldn't find me. I stood still, listening. He yelled a few times from the road, but then it went quiet. All I could hear was the wind blowing through the grass. I stood there motionless for about 15 minutes before slowly making my way back toward the road. I peeked through the grass and saw my headlights still beaming onto the pavement, with the driver's door still open. The man was nowhere to be seen. After scanning the area for another minute, I quickly grabbed my phone, ran back into the grass, and called 911. I wasn't sure if he was still hiding nearby, so I didn't want to risk staying in the open. Eventually, the police showed up, and I couldn't believe the man hadn't driven off with my car. He must have grabbed his backpack and run into the other field, or maybe even tried chasing me through the grass and didn't find me. Either way, it was clear his intentions weren't just to rob me, which made the whole situation 100 times more disturbing. I gave the police a description of the man, but there still haven't been any sightings of him. 2016. It was in 2016 when my parents had just moved to the West Coast, and I was driving there to visit them. A lot of the drive was pretty empty, with only a few gas stations spread out down the long highway. At some point during my second night of driving, my check engine light came on. I wasn't exactly surprised because my car was old and not very reliable, but I wasn't really a car person either and had no clue what could be wrong with it. I looked up the next gas station, which was about 30 miles away, but I had no choice but to make it there. However, my car decided to make that decision for me. The engine suddenly cut out, and I started coasting along the side of the road until I eventually came to a stop. I tried everything I could to get it working again, even got out and looked under the hood for any visible issues, but I saw nothing. Honestly, I thought this might be the final stretch for my car. With no other choice, I pulled out my phone, only to feel my stomach drop when I realized I had no service. I tried calling a few times anyway, but none of the calls went through. After 30 minutes of trying to figure out a solution, I realized I only had one option left: to hitchhike for a ride. I had never done it before and was nervous, not knowing what to expect. It always seemed like something strange I'd never think I'd do, but I was running out of options. I stood on the side of the road and waited. Every 15 minutes or so, a car would pass by, but none of them stopped for me. This went on for hours, and it was probably around 2 o'clock or 3 a.m. when I saw the headlights of another car coming down the road. I stuck my thumb out, thinking it would pass by like the rest, but to my surprise, it slowed down and started pulling over. It was a black pickup truck, and I couldn't really see the driver until I walked around to the side of the car. The man was very skinny, with a long thin face that matched his long black hair. It was a little unsettling. "Need a lift?" he asked, smiling widely. Something about this guy was off, but I was tired and knew this might be my only chance for a ride, so I didn't pass it up. I hopped into the back seat. Trying to make the best of the situation, I thought it would be polite to make some small talk, so I asked him what he was up to tonight. "Just cruising on the highway," he replied casually, as if it were a hobby. It struck me as odd, considering we were in the middle of nowhere. I was surprised he didn't ask me why I was out here or what I needed, but I figured I'd try to keep the conversation going. But then he interrupted my thoughts when he looked at me in the mirror. "You don't have any weapons on you, right?" he asked, his voice oddly cheerful. "Just making sure I'm safe." I thought it was a strange question to ask so bluntly, but answered no, unsure if he was genuinely concerned or just weird. After that, I stopped talking. About 10 minutes later, I was staring out the window when the man made a sudden turn off the highway onto a dirt road. My heart raced as I sat up straight and looked around, realizing that this was definitely not where I needed to be. "Where are we going?" I asked, a bit more urgently. He shot a quick look at me but didn't answer. I repeated my question, louder this time, fear starting to rise in my chest. "Where are you taking me?" By now, I knew that if the car stopped again, I was going to bolt. I got ready, my hand on the door, as he drove down the rough road. Suddenly, a small farmhouse appeared in the dim light. The front door was wide open, and the whole place looked abandoned, falling apart. As we got closer, he slammed on the brakes, and I lurched forward into the seat. He immediately opened his door and ran around to my side. I swung my door open too and sprinted for the tree line. The man ran after me, but once we were in the woods, it was so dark that I could only hear his footsteps. I couldn't see him, even though he was just 10 or 15 feet behind me. I took a sharp turn, ducking behind a tree and holding my breath. His footsteps passed right by me, continuing further into the woods. A whole minute passed before I heard his eerie voice call out to me from the darkness. He repeated the same lines over and over in a disturbingly calm tone. "Come on, let's go back. I'll give you a ride." I wasn't trying to scare you. I never heard his footsteps return toward the car, and I had no idea where he was or if he was hiding nearby, waiting for me. My heart pounded as I knew I had to leave. I started walking quietly in what I hoped was the direction of the main road. I couldn't see anything, but after a while, I pulled out my phone and turned the brightness on low. Somehow, I had service. I almost cried from the relief and immediately dialed 911, hoping they could track my call. Thankfully, I made it back to the main road, where two officers met me. By that time, the man and his truck were gone. I still don't know how he managed to leave without being seen. As for the farmhouse, it turned out to be just an old abandoned place. which makes it even stranger that the man knew exactly where it was and turned onto that road on purpose. I have no idea what the man intended to do, and I'm just glad I didn't have to find out. My family owns a large plot of land filled with trees, and at the edge of the property, they built a cabin. Compared to the main house, it feels a lot more isolated and secluded in the woods. This year, I took a trip there at the end of October to visit my parents and siblings. Since the house was full, I volunteered to stay at the cabin for a few days while I was there. On the first day I arrived at the property, there wasn't a road you could drive on to get to the cabin, so I parked at the main house. I had a light backpack with my stuff, mainly planning to just sleep at the cabin, so I didn't bother taking it there immediately. Around 5 p.m., we had what I guess you could call a small party, since it was the first time in a while that all of us were together. We shared some food, drinks, and caught up with each other. It was a good time, but after a few hours, I was exhausted, so I told everyone I was heading to the cabin for the night to get some sleep. I grabbed my backpack and left through the back door. The trail to the cabin was very thin, and it was about a 10-minute walk. I hadn't even thought about it getting dark, so when I stepped onto the trail, I realized there were no lights or anything along the way. I had to turn on the light on my phone just to see where I was stepping. A little ways down the trail, I suddenly heard a stick snap behind me. I turned and looked, but my phone light was so weak that it barely illuminated anything. I figured it was nothing and kept walking. A couple of seconds later, though, I heard it again. It was as though, as soon as I started walking, something behind me started walking too, like I was being followed. "Who's out there, Alex? I know it's you, not funny, bro," I called out, hoping it was just my brother being annoying. I knew if it were him, though, he'd have been cracking up by now. The unease settled in quickly as the suspense of not being able to see anything started getting to me. I kept walking, now moving faster. I heard leaves crunching several times as I continued making my way to the cabin, though I didn't turn around, knowing I wouldn't see anything anyway. I hoped it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had drunk a little too much earlier, but whatever it was, I didn't want to be out in the woods any longer. I hurried and finally made it to the cabin. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. After tossing my bag on the floor, I rubbed my face in stress, trying to shake off whatever I had just experienced. Just then, I heard a subtle sound from the other side of the door. It was someone turning the knob and trying to open it, and right after realizing it was locked, they started banging on the door, not just knocking, but full-on hitting it. I almost fell over from the shock. They kept banging on it, and with nothing else to do, I walked up and looked out the small window next to the door to see who it was. What I saw was a man wearing a dark jacket and heavy boots, someone I had never seen before in my life. I only looked for a moment before his eyes shot over at me, full of rage, and he immediately started pounding on the window. Then, out of nowhere, a voice yelled from the woods. The man paused, then sprinted in the opposite direction. About 30 seconds later, I looked out the window again and saw my brother, Alex, running up to the cabin. I guess he must have seen the man come up behind me as I was heading to the cabin, and after asking my parents if they knew him, he came running for me. To this day, we've never seen the man again, and we have no idea what he was doing out in the woods on our property or why he was stalking me that night. It still scares the hell out of me to think about it.